Hello everyone and welcome to this session. It is Sensory Systems, Designing and Managing a Sensory Panel. Now, when you're coming to the tasting of things, the analysis, the sensory aspects of spirits, there's one man that you go to. That man is Matthew Pawley, and he's joining us now. Hello to you, Matthew.
Hello there, David. Nice of you to invite me along, and thanks very much to the organisers for making this happen. So yes, so today we're going to be talking about sensory panels and really kind of the whys and hows and what's the points and all that sort of thing. So this is not going to be the most comprehensive sort of PhD level sensory panel description, but what we're going to do is give you an overview for sort of the man on the street, the distiller on the street, if you will, as to how to start a basic sensory panel and kind of incorporate that into your best practice and really how you manage your distillery, but also your distilled spirits. So without much further ado, let's crack on. So just to give you an idea of why it is I'm sat in front of you today, I am Assistant Professor of Distilling at Heriot-Watt University. I'm also a PhD student part-time in the sensory aspects of gin. I'm a consultant to industry through Distillers Nose Limited and potential YouTuber, which watch this space. I'm a graduate of Heriot-Watt University, an Englishman in Scotland, and a home counties escapee. If you look there, I am not quite in London, but London adjacent. What have I done? I've spent 2 summers in Speyside as a student. I was one of those annoying students that was constantly trying to get industry experience. I worked with Tate & Lyle in North Greenwich, worked with Bacardi Product Development as the master distiller for Oxley Gin. I worked as a distiller for Bombay Sapphire when they moved from Greenhalls to Laverstoke Mill, their current new Laverstoke Mill site, which I recommend you go and check out if you haven't seen. It's an absolutely stunning site. Anyway, enough with the life story. Let's crack on with the rest of the content. So what's the point? So your consumers will never be able to pick up on the subtle differences. Anyway, this is kind of like the operator grumble you get when you try and start off a sensory taste panel. And really, you are the gatekeepers of your brand. So you are in charge of controlling subtle nuances, and subtle nuances that you notice are the sort of the warning signs of potential of what's known as product drift. And what is product drift? So you, as producing your brand, you are ensuring that your second bottle is fulfilling on the promises made by your first bottle. So your consumer has looked at your marketing, has seen all your fantastic materials and has bought your product and is now a fan, is now on board and has obviously gone to multiple platforms on social media to try and hail this fantastic product and what a wonderful flavor it is and what wonderful cocktails it makes. So the problem is that over time, if you're not very, very careful, if you're not on the lookout, you can potentially have what's known as flavor drift. And this is where that second bottle starts to drift away in the flavor performance from the first bottle. And really, it is your job to make sure you're fulfilling the promises made. It is literally your business to catch a problem before it goes out the door.
I guess with people that are drinking different products, they might buy the first bottle, but they might not be getting the second or the third, but they might then buy like the 7th or something like that. So this drift that you're talking about, one little change between the two you might not notice, but then as that sort of builds up 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that's when you're talking about with these big changes, isn't it?
So we're talking about like minor variations batch to batch, but you're correct that those minor variations can add to quite a lot of, quite a big difference over time. And so yes, it's very, very infrequently that you'll get a consumer, unless they're very dedicated consumers, who will buy, the next batch of a particular product. And, certain people may, especially if it's something like a seasonal drinks that you buy over Christmas, it might be a Christmas to Christmas purchase, a nice Christmas treat. I'm sure you've all got drinks you think, yeah, I'll get a bottle of that in for Christmas. Well, you want it to taste the same from one Christmas to the next. And that's really where you need to be on the lookout for those minor differences. So really, this needs to be built into the fabric of how you organize your practice and how you organize your distillery as part of best practice and what's known as due diligence. So that just means that you're keeping a lookout, and really it should be part and parcel of the quality control that really helps you sleep at night. So to produce a clean and meaningful data set means that when you do your panels, you're actually being fair and asking the correct question, and getting the correct answer out of the question you're asking. So when I say that, each time you sit your panelists down, you're asking them to spot a difference. And what you're asking them is a particular question between two different batches, if that makes sense. And really, it's all about asking the right question and then holding your panel in such a way that you get a meaningful answer. And that answer is expressed through data. And the data needs to be kept clean and meaningful. And we'll talk about how we maintain the status of your data to keep it meaningful in a moment.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to ask you. Sorry, I'll cut this little bit out because I'll ask you another. This is a good time to ask you about, like, is this a good time to have the more practical example that we talked about, or do you want to?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. So let me get the academic bit out of the way, and then.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, where would we
can talk about it? We can talk about it at the end. That's fine. I'll just let you.
What about your ideal panelist?
Yeah.
And then the ideal. So maybe, yeah. I don't know where. I don't think there is a spot to put it in. Just crack on and ask. let's just roll with it. It's fine.
Okay. Let's go back to one of the things I wanted to what I'll mention here, but I won't do the full worked example is. Because I guess, like, when some people start distilling, they're like, well, I'm following the same recipe. It's got to be the same every time. And I think, so I'm going to make that point now. Okay. So anyway, we're still recording, so I'll just keep going on. Let me think how I'm going to start that question now. Okay. 3, 2, 1. So I guess it's quite, when you're first starting to distill, it's easy to think, well, I'm following the same recipe, you know, whether that be I'm making whiskey or rum or gin or whatever, surely it should be the same. But I guess because you're using these natural resources, there's seasonality, there's the temperature in your distillery, the ambient temperature between winter and summer. These are all things that can create these little variations, and that's the reason why you want to check against some sort of reference each time as you go through, that you're largely on course with your with the spirits that you're releasing.
Well, absolutely, David. You make an excellent point. And as an academic, we lecture to the students. We have a chemical engineer come in, and it's always important to get different perspectives. And I like to have, when teaching distilling, have people from different perspectives come in. So we'll have a guy who's worked for 40 years in the whiskey industry and a chemical engineer in. And really, when the chemical engineers look at it, they say, well, a difference in reflux isn't a massive amount of difference numerically. But then what we've found is, and we know through sort of empirical knowledge, is that those small differences can make a massive difference to the final sensory delivery of the product. So, you know, we know that the thresholds of these chemicals, the threshold being the point at which you can actually smell the thing and it becomes noticeable, is actually really, really small. So being so small means that we're really sensitive to really minute and small changes. And don't forget, the sense of smell has been a way of surviving for millennia. And so it's really important that we are able to have such a sensitive sense of smell, hard to say, in order to pick out those minor differences, because at one point in our evolution, it was a mere matter of life and death. So you're right, with the tiny minute differences that happen because of life, because of the fact that you say a change in weather conditions and seasonality, because of you're buying in your botanicals, because, you know, then when we come into sort of cask matured things like whiskey, it's a whole other thing, because that's another natural product containing different amounts of sugars and different volatile compositions. So you're absolutely right. So those tiny minute differences can have a massive impact on the sensory performance of your product. So it's really important to kind of sweat the small stuff on this, because it's that small stuff that we're picking up on. Okie dokie. So in academic applications, so theories can be proven or disproven in academic trials, but we do that at a small scale because we can take bigger risks. Because obviously it takes quite a lot of persuasion to say to a distiller that does a 12,000 litre distillation run, by the way, we would like to take, you know, 30 grand of your botanicals and however much of your grain neutral spirit, and would you mind if we did something different? That's quite a big amount, a big sales, a big, Sorry, can I do that again?
Yeah, say that bit again. That's fine.
Okay, thanks.
3, 2, 1. Yeah.
So in academics, and I'll try again.
Sorry, that's fine.
Lost me flow, me creative flow state, David. Right, let's go.
3, 2, go.
Okay, so in academia, we do sort of sensory tasting panels to try and prove and disprove various theories, because at small scale we can take greater risks, because it's quite a sales gig and amount of buy-in for a company to say does a really large, like a 12,000 litre distillation, to say, do you mind if we take 30 grams of your botanicals and do something slightly different, never mind the grain neutral spirit. So in academia we do small scale trials, and really we use the sensory taste panels as a way of proving or disproving the impact of whatever theory we're trying to prove or disprove. And really, when you combine this with analytical chemistry, that's when you're starting to get some really interesting results. And my research as a PhD student is where we take analytical chemistry and then comparing that to sort of sensory outcomes and seeing if we can build those relationships. And that starts to become more powerful. We're talking about real world impacts of various different things that we as analytical chemists are observing. With a highly trained panel, tiny differences can be picked up on. So don't forget, there is nothing more sensitive than the human nose. So we talked about analytical chemistry, and often we can pick things up on the nose, smelling, the distiller's nose, if you will, more greater sensitivity that we couldn't even dream about picking up on. They're at the detectable threshold of your nose, but below the detectable threshold of the analytical chemistry. So you can also combine those two things together, and which is an awesome way of spending an afternoon, which is a thing known as gas chromatography organoleptics. And this is where you identify flavor chemicals by putting yourself at the end, you're plugging your nose into a machine. Like I say, it takes a bit of a while to get hold of, because you're kind of being asked to sniff for an extended period of time. And eventually you are going to have to breathe out. So that always can be somewhat problematic, because you can't just constantly smell for 45 minutes non-stop. And you plug your nose into the machine, and your nose is then at the end of the machine, you're picking out the molecules and you're taking down sensory notes on a timestamp basis. And it's really quite interesting. And it's at that point that you can identify your flavor active compounds and the characteristic flavors of those compounds. It's really quite interesting, but at the same time, slightly bizarre, like all the best things in life. So imagine if you have 3 glasses in front of you, and they are A, B, and C, and top tip, I highly recommend string-based luggage tags or a Sharpie pen or other pen that is indelible pen to put on the bottom of your glasses. So you can go A, B, and C, and then if it gets a heated debate and people are moving glasses around willy-nilly, A is still A and B is still B. And there's nothing worse than if you get someone along who's feeling very avuncular on your taste panel and they mix them around, and all of a sudden it's like that game Spot the Lady where you've got to try and chase the ace or whatever it's called. So yeah, mark up your glasses or use string-based luggage tags, top tip. You're looking to assess the impact of differences in the spirits by playing spot the difference with the panelists. So you've got A, B, and C in a triangle test, and you're trying to say, like, A is the different one. And a well-run panel will have a different difference every time. So the first panelist may come and it may be A, the next panelist, the difference may be C, and also you swap the differences. So you may have 2 of one and 1 of the other, and then you swap it round, so you have 1 of the other and 2 of the next sample. So, you know, each time you should be exposing the product to the same amount of noses each time. That's if in an ideal world, and I know that certain practicalities may get in the way. But what you're trying to do is ask your panelists to spot the difference amongst 3 or sometimes 4 samples. So the trouble is you're relying on human perception. And human perception is very easily influenced. In actual fact, there's a whole £1 million industry dedicated to altering human perception of products known as marketing. And that's important. We need marketing. Without marketing, there is no business. There is no industry. No one has a job. So what we need to do is try and overcome the external influence that could potentially alter the human perception of the product. So consciously or unconsciously, we want to be good boys and girls. We want to pass the test. We want to be the best in class, even if we don't know it. So we are trying to look for a difference or based on something other maybe than just the smell of the sample. So what we need to do is we need to make sure we are controlling the samples that are being sent out, so that that way the only difference is the difference that you're looking for, okay? So you're controlling the other variables, and that the only variable, the only difference is the difference you are particularly looking for. The other thing is we've got to try and maintain a degree of sort of level-headedness so that our judgment isn't being affected by potential other influences. So, for instance, if the boss comes in and who owns the company and everything about it, and you know, yes, we don't want to cause trouble and you want to be promoted, and you really would rather not make too many waves. So we've got to try and make sure that there isn't external psychological influences. You know, people, I find people with a huge vested interest, stakeholders in the brand, can sometimes maybe be worse at picking out the differences because they don't want to find a difference, because they would much rather it went out the door and off you go. So these are the things you need to worry about when you're thinking about putting together your panel. This is how you protect the purity and the meaning of your data, okay? And that's something we're going to be coming back to, because without purity, there's no meaning and life is meaningless. But we don't want that. We know that there is meaning in life, I'm sure. So how do we protect the purity of our data? So each panelist must not smoke, vape, eat or drink at least an hour before they sit on the panel, mainly due to odor carryover on clothes, as well as kind of tainting your palate. So here in Britain, we are fairly famous for curries. And I have to say, curries are possibly one of the worst meals to have before a taste panel, because there's such a full level of intensity, lots of garlic, lots of onions, delightful and delicious as they may be. You really probably shouldn't have a curry at least an hour before your taste panel, or indeed any other food or drink in case of. So also, you need to prepare your samples in the same way. Each sample needs to be the same to try and, as I say before, eliminate the differences, control your variables. The samples need to be at the same temperature, because temperature affects the ability of the molecules to kind of form in the top of the glass. So what we're doing, our noses are looking for molecules. What we're doing is we're trying to saturate the headspace, that's the space between the liquid and the top of the glass, and we're trying to stick our noses in and sample those molecules. So if the temperature is different, then you have a different number of molecules, or different profile of molecules even, in the top of the headspace. Each needs to be at the same strength. We're comparing apples with apples. We could have, everything has to be the same strength, so there's no point having one at a stronger ABV than the other. We put a watch glass, okay, this is a watch glass, and you can get them from scientific equipment suppliers, and this is a cunningly branded ICBD branded tasting glass. And this is an ISO 9000 tasting glass that which means that if you're tasting something in Australia, you can use the same glass in Hong Kong, in Scotland, in Edinburgh, in Putney, it doesn't matter. You're using the same glass for the same job in different locations. Again, controlling the variables, controlling the differences. You shouldn't let the sample sit for longer than 15 minutes, ideally, because again, those molecules start to dissipate, we lose the molecules, and therefore you're losing the very thing you're looking for. And as a distiller, the very thing you spend a lot of time and effort and inclination putting into your product. The more panelists, the better, okay? So in statistics, the more numbers, the more powerful the data. So it's important that you have as many taste panels members as you can possibly muster. Okay? So protect the precious. By that I mean the data. Remember, your panelists, if your panelists manage to cheat, this renders the data tainted, biased, and meaningless. You need, as the panelist manager, to protect the meaning of the data you're generating. So what is the ideal panelist? So the ideal panelist is not surrounded by the smells of production all day. So the person who stood stillside all day with all those smells going up their nose all the time, they can become what's known as nose blind. This is known as supernormalization. This is where it's another survival technique, because if you were having to think about the things you were smelling that you smell every day, one, life would be exhausting. You'd be distracted all the time. So what you're looking for is new smells and new differences. So therefore, our brain is very clever at screening out smells that we experience every day. So the person who's surrounded by the smell of your product every day may not be the best panel member. As we said before, you must be relatively uninvested in the result. I know that we're all very passionate about our products, and that's what makes the industry and our students so interesting and to do business with and to teach, because we're all massively passionate. But in this instance, you've got to try and come with a certain amount of game face, where you look at it dispassionately and make a judgment call based on purely the sensory performance of those samples. Preferably young noses. It should be preferably a young taste panelist, obviously not too young, within common decency and honesty and ethical dilemmas. They're not too young, but it has been proven by science that older noses get tired, and I'm sure some of the people who are watching this may be able to sympathize with that kind of feeling and notion. And there has been peer-reviewed actual science, I'm sorry chaps, that actually female noses are more sensitive to the subtlety and nuances of sensory analysis. Some of the females may actually be quite concurrent that sometimes men aren't particularly good at picking up on subtleties and nuances without making too many broad-based gender statements. You shouldn't come wearing strong scents, perfume or aftershave. I have verbally but not physically ejected people from my sensory panel for coming and smelling far too fabulous by half. So it's important that you come smelling vaguely neutral. So yes, now is not the time to splash it all over or whatever. There was a catchphrase back in the day for, I think it was Brute, wasn't it? Anyway, I digress. Anyway, so the ideal taste panelist should come with an open mind, an open nose, and preferably not too smelly. So the ideal sample size would be roughly 30 mils in an ISO 9000 tasting glass, 20% ABV by volume. You can sometimes taste things at 40%, but please be aware that the alcohol at 40% could burn your nose. Don't forget, the olfactory bulb within the nose are the only exposed brain cells exposed to the atmosphere, okay? So they're very, very sensitive, okay? If they aren't the only exposed brain cells exposed to the atmosphere, you must go to a doctor immediately. But you also need to make sure that, make myself laugh there, sorry. It's been a long day. You also need to make sure that you treat those brain cells really carefully, okay? Because they're very, very sensitive. You don't go blasting them with 40% ABV without care and attention to detail. You also must evaluate smell before taste. So therefore, the fact that when you're tasting things, you're forcing molecules up to the back of your nose, okay? This is known as, it's important to evaluate smell before taste, because this is because when we're taking a sample into our mouth and we're making slurpy noises because we're not at tea with our grandmother and we're slurping away, what we're trying to do is force the molecules up the back of the nose, as this is known as retronasal smelling. And this can influence your cognition and the way that you notice smelling. So therefore, what we do is we do orthonasal smelling, which is through the front, and then we do into the mouth and we do retronasal smelling. But it's important that the retronasal smelling isn't influencing the orthonasal smelling. So what you do is you smell first and then you taste, okay?
Yeah, great. I had a question about the alcoholic strengths. So if you've got it at 20 or 40%, how quickly do you need to proof down your sample beforehand? I mean, do you need to leave it for a bit? If it's, let's say it was at 40% anyway, but you wanted it at 20%, do you just add the 50-50 mix of water and then it's ready to taste straight away? Or do you want to leave it for a bit? I know there's a little bit of heat will be released from that proofing. So any thoughts on that?
So really, you're trying to saturate the headspace. You're trying to fill that space between the liquid in the glass and the top and your watch glass. So I would say I would give it at least 5 minutes to kind of let that kind of build up, so you've actually got something to smell. Because if you, as you say, pounce on it too quickly in all eagerness and passion to really get involved, you can sometimes not really allow that headspace to fully saturate. So yeah, I would give it 5 minutes and a bit of a mix. I tend to give it a bit of a swirl, and then sort of let it sit for 5 minutes and let it kind of chill out and let that headspace saturate nicely.
Good sensory takes time.
Yeah. What is the ideal sensory room? Well, ideally, and we are talking in ideal terms, I know that sometimes not all of these are applicable or indeed possible. The ideal sensory room is free of odours, light and airy, clean and uncluttered. And if you're doing multiple panels occurring simultaneously, booths might be a nice idea to construct some form of booth formation in order to try and stop the influence of the person next to you, and if you're all trying to copy the boss or the person you think's got the better nose. Spittoons to allow you to spit out a sample between, so you can taste and then not necessarily swallow. Because again, you know, if you're swallowing the sample and it goes down, not to wishing to be a killjoy, by the way, and it's going into your belly, and then you might be a little bilious. I know it happens. It's not to be crude, and then maybe that you burp and then some of those molecules come back up, and that's important that you maybe don't influence you that way. So spittoons and glasses of water. So I have a glass here full of water, which is, it's not gin and it certainly isn't beer, to kind of, you know, cleanse the palate and whatnot. I would also say that it's a good idea to have lots and lots and lots, and I mean more than you would think you're going to need, of clean glassware. Because there's one thing sensory tasting panels use is glassware, and they use them at quite an alarming rate. It doesn't, if you've got 4 samples, you know, it doesn't take much before you have a significant amount of glassware on your hands. And as someone who used to run a tasting company before you could rent ISO 9000 tasting glasses, I know that all too well. I have a flat in Edinburgh full of ISO 9000 tasting glasses, and even now I rent them because they arrive clean and they go away dirty. But always get more than you need, okay? Have more glassware than you need, and then that way you're not tempted to cut corners by, I'll give it a little bit of a rinse. I'll give it a rinse under the tap and a dry on the tea towel, and away we go, we'll be fine. And that's a nightmare, exactly. It brings me out in the horrors, because all of a sudden there's all kinds of variables and potential crossover and what's on the tea towel and all other sorts of various different questions that need to be asked. So yeah, have more than you need, and have some left over. That's fine. You can all chill out at the end of the taste panel and taste the nicest, your favorite gin out of the ones that are left over. That's a money well spent, is having an abundance of riches in clean glassware. Okay, the great exception in the room. It's been a while and I haven't mentioned COVID-19, so as is the way of things, it's now time to talk about the global pandemic and its influence and impact. So many more remote tastings are going on. That's good. That means that we have people around the world who can partake in your taste panel potentially. This still requires some training because it's important that we get meaningful data. Your panelists need to be aware of their surroundings. Don't forget, you are more used to the smell of your house than anybody else. So do it in familiar surroundings with familiar smells. That way, that the only difference is the smell in your glass and the saturation of your headspace. And one of the unintended consequences is people are much, much less inclined to share a glass with another person. So, you know, having just come through a upper respiratory tract infection pandemic, we are somewhat less inclined to share a glass that someone else has had their upper respiratory tract on. So people need clean glasses, back to having more clean glasses than they know what to do with. Another kind of word to the wise there. What is significance? What are the odds? So a difference is only a difference if it's detected by a larger number of people than if simply by guessing. So if I have 3 glasses in front of me, I have a 1 in 3 chance of just coming in and being like the lazy operator and going, oh, it's that one, leave me alone. And if you do that, you've got a 1 in 3 chance of getting it. So a difference is if your result shows that you've got a greater detection rate than 1 in 3. Training your ninja noses. How do you train your ninja nose? We've got things such as smelling kits, and these are commercially available from commercial companies. And this allows you to practice on particular purified or particularly kind of industry standard smells. So you can pick out different kits for different characteristics, and they give you those compounds. And getting those compounds in the purest form is really expensive. So especially analytical grade, those are, to get it pure so that we get meaningful results from the analytical, it's really, really expensive because they have to be so incredibly pure. Practice makes perfect. So what we mean is by the better you are, the more you smell, the better you become at smelling. And this is known as neural plasticity. And this is where your brain becomes better at doing something, having done it repeatedly. And I, in the past, have had students and sent them on a nasal safari. So we're based in Edinburgh. So I send them down a particular street, maybe, I don't know, the likes of Princes Street in Edinburgh. And I say, right, walk the length of Princes Street. And I want you to notice all of the smells you smell as you walk along Princes Street. And you might be able to get, you know, from one end, the smell of North British Distillery, because that's at the west end of Edinburgh. And then as you walk down, you might walk past a coffee shop. You might walk past a guy selling burgers from a van. You might walk past, now with the advent of vaping, you can get some really quite intense nasal experiences as you walk down the street. It's like someone forcing a strawberry up your nose. So, you know, become better at noticing what your sort of nasal or organoleptic landscape is, if you will. And then start kind of attributing those smells to various different characteristics and sort of build up an eloquence and vocabulary around what you're smelling, and just generally practice, really become more mindful and living in the present moment with what you're actually smelling. Data, data, potato, potato. So we have lots of numbers, but now we need meaning. So I'm afraid to say, David, it's time to bring on the stats. So what we're looking to try and calculate is what's known as a p-value. And the p-value is the value that dictates the number of people who picked the difference. Okay, this sounds hugely worrying and hugely scary, but there are statistics tables to make this easy, and I'm not going to pronounce the ISO number. You can look at that on the slide. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at the null hypothesis, which is if everyone just picked it out by guessing, if we had a lazy operator who really didn't care and just wanted to get on with his tea break and chose, you know, any old one, we're trying to disprove and reject the null hypothesis. And if we are getting a p number, that means it is greater than chance, you can reject the null hypothesis and everything has meaning. So it's very, very exciting if we can get a good p number. As a scientist, once the stats starts to work, things get really quite interesting.
Well, thanks very much for that, Matthew. It's given us a really good overview and an introduction, because I think, well, I've learned something from it, and I'm sure a lot of people watching might not have really thought about this. They might have thought that this is really something that these big distilleries do, but maybe not so much for myself. So in that sort of vein, it would be quite nice to kind of have a bit of a discussion about how on a smaller scale this could be applicable. So I think we talked about, you know, each time you were doing a distillation batch or something like that, you might want to do this, you know, the triangle test or something, this sensory panel. And that would be against, I believe, a reference sample. Is that the right terminology that you'd use?
So yeah, you've got to, so to make sure you're fulfilling on the promise of your first bottle, when it comes to your second, you use your reference sample. And really, as an organization, you have to agree that this is going to be the reference sample and keep that as your guideline. And what I would say is sort of keep a number of bottles of your reference sample, wrap them in foil, possibly with sellotape or some form of other tape. Other tapes are available, and then put them in your freezer, and that will hopefully keep them dark and cold and stop them from moving. Because obviously, if you've got to have a reference that has to be relatively stable so that you're not constantly everything isn't constantly drifting.
And is this with the sensory, is it something that can be done just with the nose, or is both aspects of it important? Because I guess I know sometimes I've seen people they might use the nose from a sample like that, and then what they've not used, because they've not even tasted it, they've put that back in their reference bottle. I mean, is that something that you can do to keep that reference bottle going? Or, I mean, how do you refresh it?
The scientist in me kind of sees that and has a mild triggering anxiety. Okay, I'm wearing the white coat for a reason. This is not just a shorthand for being clever, David. So I would suggest, because what you've done is you've had this in the glass and it's sat around and we've all had a lovely chat about it, and it's sat, and then someone left the lid off, and then, you know, someone else got distracted by their phone because the phone went, and it sat there for some time, and then, David, you want to pour it back into the bottle.
I know people that have done it, so
Well, I mean, none of the people I like and respect, is it, David? So no, I would, in all seriousness, suggest maybe discarding that sample that's been sat in the glass in the sunshine in a warm room with the lid off, whilst we all have a good talk, and, you know, someone with perfume walks past and whatever, and then start from scratch for the next time. So, you know, no double dipping.
No, but when you're happy with that, your more freshly produced batch of spirit is in line with the reference sample, then of course you can use that as a future reference sample, right? That's the concept behind it.
Potentially, yes. So you've got to then, because there will come an end. So even if you've got sort of 3 bottles kept by, there'll come a point where you run out of that reference. And yes, it's important to think of a sort of succession. Think, well, you know, we were particularly happy with this blend, or we were particularly happy with this batch before bottling, and keep some bottles of that to one side with a view to having the next reference sample. So yeah, that's something to bear in mind.
And so on that basis of a kind of, you know, batch to batch kind of quality check, as it were, at what point in the distillation would you and you know, let's say if it's like whiskey or gin or something, at what point in the distillation do you want to do those checks? Is it straight off the still? Is it once you've proofed it, once you've bottled it? Where would you do it?
So I'm fairly sure the majority of the viewers at home, it would check most of the things they make as a kind of a basic quality sort of, you know, distillation by distillation basis. But really, the real flash points are where you've taken something and blended them together. So then you take that blend and then you assess it. And also, if you have put the product through a series of processes, and really the next kind of pinch point that becomes important is sort of immediately before you start bottling. So having, you know, run it through, you know, you having blended it, you've done a triangle test, you're happy with the blend, you run it through, because it will run through a filter, run through a filling machine, potentially a vacuum filler, and then run, you know, it gone into the bottle. Then really you should be tasting it to make sure that the impacts of all of those processes has not adversely altered the sensory performance of that product.
So then would you theoretically need to have a reference sample like post blend and then a separate reference sample post bottling to do those?
So I don't think ideally, you know, if your bottling procedure is impacting to that degree of significance, you need to revisit your bottling procedure. Okay, the filtration, you know, we all put our product through filter to make sure that there isn't anything, you know, that could have potentially end up in the final product, but the filtration process shouldn't be impacting that much to the final actual product as it goes down the line. But that's a good question, David.
Yeah, so it could be the same reference sample. And I think one of the other things to particularly be aware of, in addition just to the day-to-day, is any time when you might be making a big change to how your production works. So that might be that you've upscaled your recipe to a larger still, or you've introduced a second still, but it's basically the same, but it's another still, or you've changed your water source or your filtration. Any big change in the products, that's another time to really be extra keen and focus to check that you're getting that continuity, that consistency in the flavor. Is that reasonable?
So as I always say in distilling, if you change one thing, you change 3 things, because there is so much going on within a distilled beverage. There's an awful lot of engineering going into sort of the chemistry and all of that going inside the bottle that we still fully don't entirely know all that's going on. So you have to be very, very careful when you're changing things that you don't change things away from the actual reference sample. So yes, you're absolutely right. Anything you do, anything you change can and potentially will have an impact on your finished product, and needs to be considered and really scrutinized and drilled down on in this fashion.
Moving to actually picking the panel, choosing the panel. I mean, if you weren't producing, as you might not be if you're starting on quite small, if you're not producing every day, would you suggest it's better to do the analysis, if you're doing it in a distillery, say, on a day that you hadn't been producing, because there wouldn't be so many aromas and things around?
Well, that's it. You've got to try and find a relatively, what they call it, aroma neutral or aroma free environment, so that you aren't. Yeah, sometimes the still house is possibly the worst possible place you could do it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
somewhere else maybe.
yeah.
My quiet, yeah.
Literally anywhere else, in fact, in the still house, with one or two exceptions.
Maybe not like the perfume counter at a department store would be a dreadful. And so then, in terms of like the number of people, I understand this idea: the more people you have, the more meaningful the data will be. But there's obviously a practical implication to that. So if I was doing a smaller group of, say, 5, 6 people to do, is it better to have an odd number or an even number? If I've only got a limited resource to find people that have got to be reliable and meet the various criteria that you discussed, what's the minimum I can get away with?
So yeah, the statisticians, which is a hard word to say, have a word that's known as power. So the power of your data, and the more numbers, the more number of people you have, the more powerful and meaningful the data can be. Because we all have our off days, even consciously or subconsciously, or someone could have an upper respiratory tract infection that affects their sense of smell. Imagine. It's important that you have, I would say, a minimum of around 5 people. It's often good to have an odd number, because if we have a sort of split or close call on the votes, then it's quite good to be able to be like, well, 3 people have said it's fine. Or 3 people have a massive issue. We all need to stop and rethink our lives, and what do we do? It's best, sometimes best to have an odd number, just so that arithmetically you can't get a tie, because then it becomes down to a battle of wills and who can shout the loudest, which is never fun.
Or who's the boss?
I own everything and I think it's fine. Send it out. If in doubt, send it out. That is not the attitude.
On the assumption that, let's just say for ease, that it was a unanimous panel and they all decided, no, there is definitely a difference here. And so your sample that this batch of distillate that you've created is different to the reference sample, and it's unanimous. Then what?
Yeah, that's when some really quite important conversations have to happen, and everyone needs to keep a level head and be thinking with their analytical brain and be like, right, what's the workaround? Is it a significant difference, or is it a difference that you can notice and that you can then mitigate? If it's significant, and if it's like a fault that stand out and be like, right, this is a real, I can spot this a mile off, then you're in trouble. You're in real trouble, because really, if it's that obvious, you shouldn't really be blending it across. But then if it's a minor difference, if it's subtle differences, then you're into sort of blending territory where you have to work around a percentage addition. And then you have to do another panel saying, right, with a test sample, it's like, right, this is an addition of X%, and at which point can you pick it up? And this is sort of, when it comes to new product development and scale up, you might start off, you have a minor difference, and then what you would do is slowly but surely increase the addition rate bit by bit, and then you'd then be looking to see if you're getting complaints back from the customers. But and really you shouldn't be getting complaints back from the customers, because at that point it's too late, and they've gone onto multiple platforms, and Instagram's on fire, and Twitter wants to send you out to the bad place.
1-star review.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of, you then go, right, what can we do? Is there a workaround? Serious conversations, and sort of put the integrity of your brand at the forefront before all else, really.
And then I guess that we're talking about like what level is it noticeable and stuff, and I guess like that's a slightly different, because you're looking for something different to what you might be looking at in these triangle tests and that. And I guess that's, as we discussed before we started recording, the difference between a sensory panel and a focus group. And I guess that might be moving a bit more towards that. But would I be right in thinking that there's a number of disciplines, or the disciplines that you get from a good sensory panel can be brought over to having a good focus group in terms of for new product development or that sort of thing?
So a focus group, to my mind, is more along the lines of sort of market research, and you know, there are companies out there that will specialize in going into, like, in the field, and sort of, we call it in vivo, where you go and you look at the people in a bar and say, look, how do you what do you think to this? Is there a difference? But there's also, you know, the elements of best practice that we've discussed in the triangle test can also be applied there, because again, you want it to be a meaningful data set. So, you know, it's got to be the same volume of stuff in the sample. It's got to be the same ABV, if that's, you know, not what you're looking for. So yeah, the elements of best practice and sort of, you know, discipline and good behavior, basically, and common sense are still to be brought.
Mm. And would you also say that, because it's got to be blind, so in addition to the 5 people that you had or more for your test, you need someone else that was doing the pouring, right? Someone else would need to be doing that, ideally.
So yeah, you have someone who's like the panel manager, and they are the one, the sort of the nose that knows, if you will, and they are the one pouring out the samples, because obviously, or if you are the one who normally lays out the samples, you get, you know, someone else to, you go out the room, and then another member of the panel does do one specially for you, where you don't know the difference. So that way you can still have, you've not lost a panel member because someone's being the panel.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, I was thinking about what you were saying about people wanting to cheat. And I can just so imagine that. I mean, the things where you've done tastings, people have constantly tried to work out the difference. Oh, has this one got like slightly more legs up the glass? No, it's just because how it's been poured. And so I think like as identical as it can be, like the levels, everything. I think if you're splashing it on the side a bit, maybe you need to change the glass, because you're right. People just, their mind will go really feverish to try and where's the hidden clue. This one's slightly further forward than the other ones.
Everyone wants to be good at this. You know, this is one, people want to pick out the difference, and it's a real struggle to kind of fight the kind of inner, what would you call it, like the class nerds, like me. It's like, come on now, you know, just
you got 1 in 3 chance anyway.
There's not bad odds. Go for a punt. No, well, we are all essentially, that the trouble is we're all punting on people picking out or not picking out the difference. So it's important that, you know, it's a fair test.
Good, excellent. Well, thank you very much for giving us so much of your time and your expertise. I think it's been absolutely fascinating, and we shall hopefully speak to you again soon. And thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure, which I'm sure might have come across.